So as you're sitting down, I'll show you a picture of our family. There's our 4 kids with 8 are all 8 there? Yeah, all 8 are there. That was last summer. So there we are. That will be on the test. You know, you'll need to know each of their names and birthdays, and we expect you to send presents. So, actually, let's go around the room again, and tell us your name really quick. Your name, where you're from, and a book that really influenced you. So let's start over there, really fast.
Kakashi from Japan. I love Kingdom of Priests.
About Eugene Merrill. Is that what you're talking about?
Your book.
My book? Well, you get an A. You don't have to do the paper. Okay, go ahead.
Seichi, LA, I'd say Preaching and Preachers by Martin Luther King.
Great book.
King, Joshua, from Guatemala, Soul Winner.
Soul Winner. Who wrote that?
Spurgeon.
Spurgeon. I've heard of him. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm from Vietnam. The Power of the Pursuit of God.
By Tozer.
Tozer.
Yeah, great.
James Taylor from Corona, California, and Precious Remedies.
Yeah, right. Who wrote that again?
Thomas Brooks.
Thomas Brooks. Yeah, very good.
Colin Trudeau from Southern California. I have no idea. The Bible.
The book. That's a good book. Yeah, go ahead.
Peterson from Illinois. I'd probably say Preachers and Preaching, read it for the first time last semester.
Okay.
Josh Peters, Southern California, and Risky Gospel, Owen Strachan.
Oh, yeah. When you say it, Owen Strand.
Is that how you say it?
Yeah. It looks like Strachan. Yeah.
Carol Gandy, Biblical Interpretation in Ancient Israel by Fishbane.
Okay, well. Okay. Right back there.
Simon Bloom. My favorite book is Pilgrim's Program.
Pilgrim's Progress. Yeah, okay, great.
Yeah, probably.
What's your name?
Mike Turner.
Where are you from?
Bakersfield, California.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a good one. I probably Pilgrim's Progress is up there.
Okay.
On default.
That's good. All right, let's go here. Front row.
Kendall Kaufman, Columbus, Ohio, Always Ready by Greg Bonson.
Greg Bonson, all right. Yeah, very good.
Jeff Alfasa.
Where are you from?
Los Angeles.
Tell me a book you've read in the last 10 years.
In the last 10 years.
Yeah.
With some Bonson. I think I've also enjoyed Absurdity of Unbelief. Jeffrey Johnson.
Absurdity of Unbelief, very good.
Corey Milliken from Washington. Mortification of Sin by John.
Okay, Mortification of Sin by John Owen, very good.
And Nathan Glomsky, Rochester, Minnesota. Kind of brought me out here to the Gospel According to Jesus.
Okay. John MacArthur.
Good morning, Kenneth Chung from Philadelphia, and Reformed Pastor.
Okay, Richard Baxter, very good.
Justin Phelan from Minneapolis, probably Pleasures of God.
Pleasures of God by John Piper, very good.
Chris Bogstead, Irvine, Trellis and the Vine.
Yeah, okay, very good.
Caleb DeLon from Little Rock, Arkansas, God is the Gospel by John Piper.
David from Colombia, I think A Shame of the Gospel from MacArthur.
David from Spain, the book is The Reformed Pastor.
Okay.
Robert Tingle from Southern California, The Greatness of the Kingdom, Alvin McLean.
Okay.
Justin Crable from Kansas, Practical Religion by J.C. Ryle.
Ryan Bennett from Nebraska. I would say Spurgeon's Morning and Evening Devotion. Devotional was really impactful.
That's great.
Matthew Smith from the Czech Republic, Because We Love Him by Clyde Cranford.
I don't know that book. That sounds good. Interesting. Yeah.
Jesse Randolph from Orange County, California, The Holiness of God by Sproul.
Good.
Michael from LA, Puritan Evangelism by Joe Beacon.
Okay.
Stanley Lynn, Los Angeles, Gospel According to Jesus.
Gospel According to Jesus. Let's go over here.
Steve Shankron, down in California. Years ago, Charles Ryer's Basic Theology, like the scales fell off.
Okay.
Michael Shara from Orange, Taking Hold of God.
Okay.
Connor Haas from Orange County. Probably the biography of George Whitfield by Elm.
Okay.
Winston Weber from Orange, Justification of God by John Weber.
Okay, Diane, we'll include you on this.
Diane Schreiner, none like him, Jen Wilkins.
Okay.
Aaron Haynes from Vancouver, Canada. Probably Memoirs of an Ordinary Pastor.
Jesse Fenn, the San Francisco Bay Area. Probably Knowledge of the Holy. Jabez Huang from Orange County. Probably Preaching and Preachers, Religions.
Jason from Los Angeles, Strange Fire by John Parker.
Roger John from San Francisco, probably the Gospel according to the Apostles.
Theo from the Bay Area, Holiness by J.C. Ryle.
Alex Mastronardo from LA, Till We Have Faces by C.S. Lewis.
Francis Chow from LA and Desiring God.
Grant Gates from LA, Ian Murray's biography of Jonathan Edwards.
Have we missed you?
No. Eduardo from Mexico, Peculiar Glory, John Piper.
Okay. Chris, do you have
Yeah, maybe Paul Washer's The Gospel Call and True Conversion.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Yeah, that's fascinating. Okay, let's talk about the paper for a minute. 20 to 25 pages. Okay. Research paper on an Old Testament book. Doing biblical theology. You know, the kind of things we're talking about. You should use, you know, it's a research paper, so it should be 20 to 25 sources, somewhere in there. Books, journal articles, right? You need to follow the style. There's a TMS style guide, right? So you need to follow that style for doing the paper. Be sure especially to deal with any controversial issues. Be sure to be fair to the other side if in a controversial issue. And argue your case. Finally, you want to argue your case from Scripture, right? You want to show what the Scripture says, but you want to interact with what others have done. So you want to write it, you know, you always want to work out and write clearly. I think a good way to write actually is kind of, as you're editing it at the end, kind of almost read it to yourself out loud. You know, even Gordon Fee, by the way, did that in his 1 Corinthians commentary. He read the whole thing out loud. And it reads really nicely. I found that sometimes when I'm reading a paper I've written, as I'm reading it out loud, suddenly, while I'm reading it, I'm like, that sentence doesn't work. So reading out loud is a helpful thing to do. Chris, anything you want to add?
I will send you guys the updated and most revised TMS style guide for all formatting. It's a supplement to Turabian, but there are some changes that we as an institution hold. You're responsible for all of it. While formatting isn't the largest percentage of the grade, debate would probably be the largest percentage of the grade. The fact is, you're still responsible for it and risk not getting a passing grade on the paper if your formatting is not correct.
Okay, good. Any questions about it? Yeah.
You said that it should be the entire book rather than like a section of the book. We wouldn't take a look at, like, say, the patriarchs out of Genesis or the balance of,
Yeah, I think we should stick with the book.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. I think that'd be a better way to do it. Yeah. Everybody shouldn't do Obadiah.
Well, I was gonna say, yeah, that's my question. Essentially, is you handle the 12 together. Can people take a smaller?
You
just
can do one of the 12.
Okay.
I mean, I basically handled the 12 together because my book was getting too long. You know, I mean, honestly, if I wrote the book again, I'd want it to be shorter because the fact of the matter is people are reading less today. And, I mean, there's still a place for long books, but I think there's a place for shorter books too. But yeah, that's fine. You can do one of the 12. You can even do Obadiah if you want to. That's okay. Yeah. Anything else about that? The paper is due, what, April, did you say?
Yeah.
Or March?
Let's see, March 31st.
March 31st. That gives you lots of time. But start now.
Any other clues, methodology-wise, for maybe people who are newer to the idea of biblical theology, how to begin to think through that
I mean, I think the key, you know, it sounds simple, and I think in some ways it is. I think the key to doing biblical theology is to actually, the best thing to do is to really know the text well and what are the concerns of the author of the book. So I'm just thinking of, I've taught biblical theology for years. At least the papers that have gone astray for me are, maybe they wander into talking about inerrancy. They tend to bring systematic topics in that aren't the main concern of the author. They're true. Or they want to talk about penal substitution or whatever it is. I mean, every community is different. I don't know your community as well as I know ours. But our community is very theological. I think you guys are too. And they want to bring, and of course they're there often. But is it the fundamental concern of that book? So I think that's the main error. The other thing in papers that I think of is, do you have a clear thesis? And how do you organize the paper? Is it organized in a way that readers can follow what you're doing? So, or is it just splash out in the page, everything you've learned, but it's not integrated well into a coherent piece of work. So you know, it's helpful before you write a paper to do a little prospectus or outline. Here's what you're intending to do. Here's an outline of the paper. And of course, as you read in secondary research, there may be a debate you don't even know about, and then it comes clear. Does that make sense? Maybe any word, Chris, from reading papers here that you think of?
We train as expositors, but don't forget, it's not an exposition, and so it's a focus on debate and research. So if there's an exegetical point, wager it exegetically. If there's a comment you want to add, be as condensed and concise as you can. Make your point and move on to the next one. I would suggest, and Dr. Schreiner, you might want to just declare we're going to have a table of contents required for every paper. We don't always at the MDiv level, but that might help with the prospectus idea.
That's a good idea.
Okay, so let's put a table of contents. Really think about the flow and make sure you're doing persuasive argumentation. As you guys know, we did writing workshops that are available through Canvas. There's something like 6 different sessions that I taught. If those are going to be a help to you, they'll be a help to you now. So see if you can thumb through those. And be very aware, I'll send a comment formatting key of how I'm going to grade in the margins to simplify my efforts and make sure you have a pointed comment where there's an issue. Be very aware of the key. That's going to be your key for, if you read that in advance, you'll do better on the paper.
That sounds good. Yeah, thinking of secondary sources, I mean, at least a problem sometimes I run into at Southern is for this kind of paper, right, it's best not to use, don't misunderstand me, it's best not to use John Piper, Tim Keller, John MacArthur. 'Cause their work is so helpful, but this is a scholarly paper, right? You resonate with what I'm saying there? Charles Spurgeon. So that's not the kind of paper it is. So sometimes I get papers that are like that, and I mean, I love all those people. But that's not what we're looking for in a scholarly paper. So you want to use scholarly sources. You don't want to use devotional. Matthew Henry, right? Matthew Henry's great. That's not the kind of source you want for a scholarly paper. Does that make sense? Anybody have a question about that? You understand what I'm talking about when I say that? So, I guess if you have a question about the source, I don't know, I don't want to put it all on Chris, but they could send you a quick email and say, but you're looking more for scholarly sources. Okay? I mean, if you're doing, well, yeah, that's probably enough. Okay, anything else on the paper? Right, wonderful. I hope you enjoy it. That's a great time to learn and to grow, and you should pick a book that you really want to learn more about. I did my THM thesis on Zephaniah. I wanted to do a small book, and I wanted to work on my Hebrew, and so I worked on Zephaniah, and I would not publish what I did, but at the time, I learned a lot. I learned a lot about Zephaniah, and I'm really grateful for that. Okay, so we'll go back to the text. We come to Abraham, and what we have here, what we have with Abraham is really one man against the world, right? The world's descending down. We have God's covenant with Abraham. Remember, the covenants are our backbone. I'm arguing we had a covenant with Adam. We have a covenant with Noah. Now we have a covenant with Abraham. So what I have here is what humans tried to get at Babel. God promised Abraham a great name, a great nation, a kingdom. So when he says, I'm going to make you a great nation, it's a word we can fly over quickly, right? But nation means kingdom. So he's promising him a kingdom and a blessing, and that Abraham would be a blessing for the whole world. So in that sense, right, Abraham is a new Adam. Obviously, there's not absolute continuity, but that's very important to see. Abraham is a new Adam. He's going to be the means by which the blessing comes to the whole world. He's going to reclaim the world through Abraham. I think another important thing to see is that Abraham isn't chosen because he's so virtuous. This is a very important verse for me. Joshua said to all the people, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Long ago your ancestors, including Terah, the father of Abraham, and Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates River and worshipped other gods. Abraham was an idolater before he was called. He wasn't a godly man. And I think of Romans chapter 4, verse 5, speaking of Abraham, God justifies the ungodly. Which is, we probably won't return to that again. Jewish tradition, the Jewish tradition about Abraham, if you read in Second Temple Jewish literature, Abraham is continually praised for his godliness in that literature, understandably, in some ways. Jubilees, in the book of Jubilees, one of these pseudepigraphical books, in the book of Jubilees, Abraham is praised as perfect. Perfect in his obedience. But Paul in Romans 4:5 says that God justifies the ungodly, showing that Abraham himself was an ungodly person, that he didn't belong to God natively. So God calls Abraham as an ungodly one, as to be the means by which the world will be blessed. So we see the elements of the covenant. We have the land, which is Canaan, right? But that points to a new Eden, right? Canaan or Palestine is so to speak, going to be God's garden. We have the offspring, Isaac. And of course, this is related to Genesis 1:28. The blessing is to be fruitful and multiply and to have children. You know, just incidentally, that dominion still exists today through having children. I do not argue, by the way, you have to have as many children as possible, but you know that there are societies facing a crisis that's coming because they're not having enough children. Russia, for example, do you know about that? Russia's facing a great crisis. Italy, Japan, because they're not having enough children. And of course, how are the older people going to be supported as time goes on? The United States isn't facing that problem to the same degree, and one of the reasons is because we have many immigrants coming in. But populations, you know, to sustain themselves, they need to have enough children. Even that's one of the reasons China has gone right, at least for having 2 children. So you know, there's some relevance even to today in an extended sense. What's very interesting in terms of the offspring, you could miss it in the story, but you do see in the story that we're told that kings will come from Abraham. So that's quite interesting to see, isn't it? It's not just offspring in general, but kings. And then we, as we read the story, we go fast as we go, but the promise is through Isaac and not Ishmael, isn't it? It's not, as Romans 9 says, it's not all the children of Abraham. It's not all his physical children who are the covenant children. There's a discriminating process going on there. The promise is through Isaac and not Ishmael. Isn't it fascinating when God tells Abraham in Genesis 17, by the way, that's the chapter where he's promised he'll be the father of many nations, right? Where he's circumcised. When God tells Abraham that, do you remember what Abraham says? He says, let Ishmael live before you. What is Abraham basically saying there? Abraham's basically saying, thank you very much, but we don't need Isaac. Ishmael's just fine. Sarah and I are quite content for it to happen this way. But that's not God's plan. So Abraham's quite content with it to go a different way. So God's plan and Abraham's plan are not the same. That comes out again in Genesis 21, which is cited in the New Testament twice. You know the story. This is the story when Abraham circumcises Isaac, right? And where is it? Sarah saw the son mocking the one Hagar, the Egyptian, had born to Abraham. Of course, that's where Galatians picks it up. Galatians picks it up, saying the mocking is a form of persecution, right? Galatians 4, that's picked up. So Sarah says to Abraham, drive out this slave with her son, for the son of the slave will not be co-heir with my son Isaac. Of course, the New Testament picks up that citation, doesn't it? That is the word of the Lord. Sarah is speaking God's word. Now, I actually think at the same time, Sarah has a bad attitude. It's a complex reality. Sarah is actually speaking the right thing, but her attitude is not good. She's actually sinning. She's actually sinning, but what she's saying is true. God works in surprising ways, doesn't he? Sometimes. No excuse for Sarah's bad attitude, and yet what she says is true. Ishmael and Isaac aren't heirs together. God said to Abraham, do not be distressed about the boy and about your slave. Whatever Sarah says to you, listen to her, because your offspring will be traced through Isaac. There it is. The promise comes through Isaac. And my wife says that this is her life verse in the Bible. I'm just kidding. She has never said that to me in her whole life. But whatever Sarah says to you, listen to her. That is the favorite verse of all wives. No, I'm making that up. Anyway. So Isaac is the only son, right? Genesis 22, says, so Genesis 22, what a fascinating chapter that is. You know, I wish we could linger on all these, but he's told to sacrifice Isaac, not to murder him, right? It's not a murder, it's a sacrifice to God. So he's told to sacrifice Isaac, offer him up to God as a sacrifice. And Hebrews tells us that by that time, Abraham was convinced that God would raise him from the dead if he killed him. So obviously, that'd still be a very hard thing to do, right? To plunge a knife into your son. And yet, we see a hint of that in Genesis 22, right? You see that in the story. Genesis 22, verse 4, Abraham says in verse 4, we're going to go here and we're going to return. I don't think those are throwaway words. He says, we're going to go and we're going to return. He knows Isaac is coming back with him. He knew by then that the promise had to be through Isaac. He knew the promise wasn't Isaac or maybe somebody else who comes along. No, it would be through Isaac. That God would even raise him from the dead. So yeah, the offspring now, the offspring is channeled through Isaac and not Ishmael. Here's the other thing. The story, you know, we want to think of the lineaments of the story. It takes so long for Abraham to have a single son who's the son of the promise. And that the point of the story is clearly that the promise would be fulfilled through a miracle, right? It's going to take a miracle. Abraham doesn't have the potential, the ability, even the virility to have the children on his own. Genesis 17 is the father of many nations, but he can't even have one son on his own. And by the way, I think that's one of the reasons for circumcision. You know, why circumcision? Circumcision, I think, signifies dedication to God. But I also think circumcision indicates, in a very, you know, practical way, every time, you know, I don't want to be crass, every time Abraham went to the bathroom, so to speak, right, he would recognize my ability to have children. It was a sex organ after all. My ability to have children comes from God. God promised that I'd be the father of many nations, same chapter, circumcision, right? That's God's grace in his life, that he has the children. What do we think about the Abrahamic covenant? Is it conditional or unconditional? Here I agree with Gentry and Wellham and others, they're not the only ones, that it's both. It's unconditional and conditional. I mean, I was raised in a tradition that said the Abrahamic covenant is only unconditional. But I think it's clearly both. When the covenant is enacted in Genesis 15, God passes through the animals alone as a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch, right? The animals are cut up and you go between them. Well, you all know this. You know this passage, right, in Jeremiah? I just read this in my Bible reading the other day, where it's very helpful for interpreting Genesis. You know, the Israelites freed the Hebrew slaves and they took it back. We won't worry about that. But as for those who disobeyed my covenant, not keeping the terms of the covenant they made before me, I will treat them like the calf they cut in two in order to pass between its pieces. So that's what you do, a covenant ceremony. You cut up the animals, you pass between the pieces with your other covenant partner, and but they broke the covenant, and Yahweh says, the officials of Judah and Jerusalem, the court officials, the priests, and all the people of the land who pass between the pieces of the calf, all these I will hand over to their enemies, to those who intend to take their life. Their corpses will become food for the birds of the sky and for the wild animals of the land. If you violate the covenant, you'll become like those animals, right? Cut up, destroyed. And that's the covenant ceremony. But God passes through the pieces alone in Genesis 15, bringing upon himself a self-malediction, right? A self-malediction, a curse on himself, perhaps anticipating the cross if the covenant isn't fulfilled. So ultimately, the covenant with Abraham will be fulfilled. In that sense, it's unconditional. It will be fulfilled. No, there is no way this covenant will be revoked. So there's going to be offspring, right? There's going to be land, God's king over a place, and there's going to be a universal blessing. I haven't talked that much about universal blessing. That will certainly happen. But in another sense, the covenant is conditional. God calls Abraham to obey. Desi Alexander, by the way, the D-Min class yesterday had a Q&A with Desi Alexander. Do you know Desi's work? T. Desmond Alexander. He's done a lot, and he's written this book, From Paradise to the Promised Land. Do you know that book? That's a very nice book on the theology of the Pentateuch. How many have read it? So, yeah, one of you has read it. Great book, don't you agree? And he's written a book on the servant. Well, he's written lots of things. I can't even remember them all. So he's just a great author. By the way, we're doing a commentary series for Brodman and Holman on biblical theology, and Desi's the Old Testament editor for it. So Desi does great work in biblical theology. Anyway, he says, first, the fulfillment of the divine promises is conditional upon Abraham's obedience. So we see Abraham leaving. We have an exodus from Ur and Haran. So the covenant begins here. Chapter 15 is very important because we see the covenant with Abraham depends on his faith, right? Abraham believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness. When was Abraham declared to be right before God? I think in Genesis 12, right? When he obeyed, when he went to the land. You with me? I think he was right with God when he went into the land. But that going into the land was based on faith. Hebrews 11:8. By faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed and set out for a place that he was going to receive as an inheritance. So Abraham's faith didn't begin in Genesis 15, did it? It was already there in Hebrews 11. What Genesis 15 is telling us is that the means by which Abraham was right with God was finally not his obedience, but his faith. I mean, obviously, because those are, faith and obedience have an integral relationship, an inseparable relationship. But the foundation of his relationship with God is his faith, not his obedience. Okay, I've talked about some of these things. The blessing comes because Abraham obeyed the sacrifice of Isaac. Let's read a couple of these passages, because you always want to see it in the text. After he, I guess we should say attempts to sacrifice Isaac, agrees to do it. Yahweh says, by myself I have sworn. This is the Lord's declaration, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your only son, I will indeed bless you and make your offspring as numerous as the stars of the sky. There's the offspring, right? And the sand on the seashore. Your offspring will possess the city gate of their enemies. There's the kingdom, right? And all the nations of the earth will be blessed by your offspring. There's the universal blessing. Because you've obeyed my voice. The blessing is contingent upon his obedience. We see it again in Genesis 26:5. Pick it up at verse 4. Now this is said to Isaac. I'll give you all these lands. I'll confirm the oath. So there's land, right? We should see that. I'll confirm the oath that I swore to Abraham. I'll make your offspring as numerous as the stars of the sky. There's offspring. All the nations of the earth will be blessed. Why? Because Abraham listened to me and kept my mandate, my commands, my statutes, and my instructions. So clearly the text is saying the blessing came because Abraham obeyed. So that's very important to see. I do think Desi Alexander goes astray if you read From Paradise to Promised Land. At one point, I think he goes astray because he actually speaks of Abraham as meriting the promises. He uses the word merit. I was shocked by that. That book is so good, but he actually uses the word merit. I think that's a misstep, don't you? It's his faith, not merit. We ought not to speak of merit. Perhaps Desi would just say, I'm speaking of reward. But I think given the theological associations with the word merit, it's just not a helpful word to use. So, we're not surprised then, since obedience is necessary, we're not surprised that James picks us up. We'll return to this later, maybe, where James says there's justification by works, right? Obviously, that doesn't contradict Paul, but you can see the stream in biblical theology that works are necessary. Works are necessary to receive the blessing. I mean, what sense are they necessary? Well, we already know that the works flow out of faith, don't we? But clearly the works are necessary. James himself says there's justification by works. Well, that fits with what we see in terms of the conditionality of the covenant. Anything you want to say on that issue? Any questions or comments? That the covenant, so that's a very important theme. The covenant is both conditional and unconditional. Ultimately, it's unconditional. But for any particular individual, it's conditional. Right? Make sense? You with me? Okay? So, the promise goes on, the preservation of offspring. So for the promise to be fulfilled, there must be offspring, there must be children, right? And we see the battle between the seeds. The offspring are threatened when Sarah is sold into harems. So that happens twice, right? Genesis 12, Genesis 20. What's the significance of that in the story? The significance of that in the story is, especially in Genesis 12, if Sarah is in Pharaoh's harem, the child's going to come through Sarah and Abraham. So the Sarah being taken by another man threatens the promise. Of course, Abraham disbelieves here, but God's going to fulfill his promise, isn't he? He inflicts disease on Pharaoh and threatens to kill Abimelech. So he's going to see that promise as fulfilled in his sovereignty. The promise is also threatened by Eliezer becoming the heir. So remember who Eliezer is. Eliezer is Abraham's servant. And in chapter 15, Abraham laments that the promise will be fulfilled through Eliezer rather than his own son. And that's when God says, definitely not in Los Angeles, right? Go outside and look at the stars. I mean, can you see stars here? Too many lights, right? But go outside and look at the stars, and that's how your offspring are going to be as uncountable as the stars. Isn't that we take that story for granted, but that's an amazing promise. He can't even have one kid. And now he's saying you're going to have as many, your offspring are going to be as uncountable as the stars. And of course, that's us, right? We're part of that offspring in this room. We're part of the fulfillment of that promise made to Abraham. Every believer is a child of Abraham. That's what Paul teaches us in Galatians 3 and Romans 4, doesn't he? We're all children of Abraham. I mean, Abraham believed that promise, but surely even Abraham could not have conceived how great the fulfillment would be. And we'll enjoy talking to him about that someday when we meet Abraham. The promise is also threatened by Ishmael, right? As I already said, they're quite content with Ishmael. Also, you wonder, the story is told in such a way that it takes a very long time for Abraham to have a child, but what about the land promise? And I like Acts chapter 7, verse 5, where Stephen says Abraham didn't even get a foot of land. So God gave him this great promise. You're going to have uncountable offspring. You're going to possess the land. You're going to be a blessing for the whole world. What did Abraham actually see in his life? He had one son. And he didn't, and as Stephen says, he didn't even have a foot of the land. The only land he ends up getting is a place to bury Sarah. That's the only land he possessed. So, just a pastoral word there. Right? God gives us great promises. But the circumstances in our lives may be such. I mean, maybe it's already happened to you, or maybe you're young enough you haven't experienced this yet. But the circumstances in our lives can turn in a way that you may begin to think, well, what about all those promises? My life isn't turning out at all the way I thought it would. This is not what God promised me. But remember Abraham. Abraham had these great promises, but I don't think they were fulfilled in the way and in the timing he expected. So remember that when the sufferings come, because if they haven't already come, they're going to come. And I have talked to people, maybe you have too, who will say to me, I can't follow the Lord because even though I did, I'm giving it up because my life's just too hard. This is not what I signed up for. I'm going to go another way. And Abraham trusted God, right, in the midst of that. As Hebrews says, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they were nomads. They lived in tents. They waited for the promise. God gave these great promises to them, but they really didn't see them as being fulfilled, and yet they kept trusting God. So that's a great lesson for us. Okay. The battle between the offspring continues. There's a promise of land and offspring and blessing. It's reiterated to Isaac and to Jacob. And we already saw Isaac, not Ishmael. Jacob, but not Esau, which very interesting, right? Paul picks that up in Romans chapter 9. We won't return to that passage again in this class, but that's a most fascinating passage where I don't know if you know the work of Brian Abbassiano. Brian Abbassiano, he's an Arminian. He's written 3 volumes on Romans 9 now, trying to prosecute. Brian's a great guy, a wonderful person. I've met Brian, but he's trying to prosecute an Arminian reading of Romans chapter 9 in a very sophisticated way. So if you're ever working in Romans 9, you need to look at Brian's work. I'm revising my Romans commentary, and I've interacted with the first 2 volumes. I'm not going to be able to do the third because it's going to be going to press, and I haven't been able to get my hands on it. But it'll be more of the same. I already know his stream. But I just want to say here, the promise isn't given to Jacob, isn't because he's such a nice brother. He's such a great guy. He's so much more godly than Esau. Clearly, that's not the point of the story, is it? The point of the story is that Jacob himself was quite evil. What are the obstacles to the promise? A godly wife for Isaac, right? So Genesis 24 is a very long chapter. I mean, what's the point of that chapter? The point of that chapter is that a wife is given to Isaac who's godly. So the seed can be preserved, right? The offspring can be preserved. Both Rebekah and Rachel are barren. Isaac lies like Abraham. God protects. Twice in the story, well, first, Esau threatens to kill Jacob. So Esau stands what? For the offspring of the serpent. It's really the same story over and over again, isn't it? The offspring of the serpent want to kill the people of God. That's what Esau wants to do in chapter 27. Then Laban threatens Jacob's return to the land in chapter 31. Then as they're coming back to the land in chapter 32, Jacob fears, doesn't he? Jacob fears the wrath of Esau. As you read that story, remember how he splits them up into camps to meet Esau? Because Esau's coming with 400 men, and Jacob is filled with terror that Esau is going to come and kill him and all his children and wipe out the children of the promise. But God so works that Esau is friendly to him, right? The story of Dinah and Shechem is a very interesting story as well. What's the point of that story? The point of that story is that the Shechemites want to intermarry with the Israelites, and that would corrupt the seed, right? That would be intermarrying with the offspring of the serpent. So the point to that story is God works, because remember, Shechem rapes Dinah and then wants to marry her, falls in love with her, and then they have this plan. We'll intermarry together. We'll intermarry, but the Israelites, Jacob's children, say, we'll only do it if you get circumcised. Do you remember this story? We'll only do it if you get circumcised. But their plan is, and they carry it out, once they're circumcised and incapacitated for military action, Simeon and Levi come in with servants, probably, and kill them all. So that's a quite interesting story at a number of levels. We see an interesting example of God's sovereignty, because God did not want them to marry the Shechemites. So through this incident, the purity of Israel is preserved. They don't marry the Shechemites. For the author of Genesis, I think it's Moses, for the author of Genesis, that's a good thing. The purity of Israel is preserved. On the other hand, Simeon and Levi were sinning. What they did was wrong. And we see later in Genesis, at the end of the book, that because of that, they are not given an allotment in the land. Right? So the actions that they undertook are not blessed by God. And because of that, there's a punishment. But furthermore, the story operates at a number of levels. Because of what they've done, now Jacob fears that Israel will be wiped out by other tribal groups in the land, because they know about the outrage that has been perpetrated by the brothers. So the very action by which they preserve the seed also threatens the offspring. Do you see? So you see the complexity of the story. It's operating in a number of levels. What's the hermeneutical lesson for us? We need to be careful when we tell a story not to oversimplify it, right? This story operates at a number of levels. God is sovereignly working out his purposes, yet the brothers are doing what is evil, and we have to wrap that all into the story. The ultimate lesson for us, of course, is God is working out his sovereign purposes, isn't he? God is working out his sovereign purposes in this amazing situation. So, and then we have the Joseph narrative. That is the preservation of the seed during their Egyptian sojourn. The seed are preserved, but Israel is in the wrong place. They're in Egypt, and the worldwide blessing is not there. We ought to notice Judah, the tribe of Judah, is the means by which the promise of the king will be fulfilled. We see this in Genesis 38 and then Genesis 49. The scepter will not depart from Judah, or the staff from between his feet, until he whose right it is comes, and the obedience of the peoples belong to him. So the promise of offspring will be fulfilled through a king. A king is coming. So, right, I'm arguing for kingdom through covenant. We see here that kingly theme. You might expect that king that is coming to be from Joseph. Yet surprisingly, it's from Judah. I actually think there's a rationale in the story because Reuben is excluded because he had sex with Jacob's concubine. Simeon and Levi are excluded because of their sin, and then Judah's next in line. And despite what Judah did in Genesis 38, he is not excluded. He's the next one in line, and he becomes the heir. So that's all I want to say about Genesis. We won't do every book so slowly, but Genesis is such a foundational and important book for everything. Anything you want to say? Questions, comments?
Yeah, so there's this line from like the dominion Adam's given in the garden. Possibly the promise of the seed in Genesis 3:15, government in Genesis 9, and the king's promise to Abraham. Is that a continuous line pointing towards the kingdom, or are those related in a different way? What are your thoughts?
Well, so you had a question about Noah's covenant. Say that again. I'm not sure. I'm not quite sure what you're asking me.
I just see a chain of just a bunch of references to authority being given to man, possibly through the covenant, because of dominion in Genesis like 1 and 2 in the garden.
Yeah.
Government to restrain sin in Genesis 9 in the Noahic covenant. There's also a government given to man. And then also the promise of kings later in Abraham. Are those related, or should I think of those as separate, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's an excellent question. I mean, I don't think that in Genesis there's a strong connection between the Noahic rule and the promise. I mean, all those others are clearly, there's a genetic, organic relationship. But maybe in terms of the whole canon, that's a legitimate reading. You see what I'm saying? Maybe that works. I don't think Genesis itself emphasizes that, and I'm trying to think, is there anywhere else where that's kind of picked up in terms of Noahic, the Noahic covenant? Perhaps. That'd be an interesting paper to write. You know? I mean, I just haven't thought about that, but maybe, but at least I don't think it's a direct argument. But maybe there's something there. That'd be an interesting argument to pursue. I thought I saw another hand, yeah.
So you said they killed off the Shechemites so that there wouldn't be intermarriage, and yet the Canaanite wife comes in to carry on the line.
Yeah.
How is that different?
Yeah. Well, I suppose the difference is, in terms of the whole narrative, it's a whole tribal group. It's one person. Clearly the line, when Judah goes outside, I mean, God's sovereignty, right? He works in surprising ways. But on the other hand, if there's a whole tribe that mixes in, it'll corrupt the seed. I mean, sort of like you think of Ezra. They have to divorce. They have to divorce those who are married outside of Israel. Well, I mean, you have other examples of it, right? I mean, Rahab. So perhaps it's the number of people. That's my best attempt. Yeah.
I was trying to understand. You mentioned like Simeon and Levi's brothers who were, I think the word used, were excluded from being the ones who passed down the promise. So I was trying to understand that in light of, like Jacob and Esau, Paul talking about before they did anything good or bad, for the purposes of election standing, he chose the one over the other. So how do they exclude when it seems like there's, that choosing? I guess how are you using that, the word exclude there? When it seems like there's a choosing that takes place.
Well, yeah, and
or like it's just revealing.
No, I mean, I think they're excluded, but of course they're not excluded from the promise. they're excluded from an allotment in the land. But then, I mean, actually you asked a larger question, which I'm probably going to skip, but we'll come back to it. But later Levi is rewarded because in chapters 32 through 34, Levi participates, right, in the killing of the fellow Israelites who sinned at the golden calf, and they're rewarded with the priesthood. So it's sort of reversed, you know, so then their obedience is rewarded. But we're actually not talking about salvation here so much as, hey, a place in the land, a particular place for their tribe. So it isn't, at least in...
So when you said excluded earlier, you're talking about in regards to the land.
To the allotment of the land.
Okay,
so there wasn't a special allotment in the land for Simeon and Levi.
Okay,
but they're not excluded from Israel. I'm not arguing that.
No, yeah, I thought you were saying they were excluded from being the ones who passed down the blessing of the...
No, I'm not saying that.
Okay.
I'm not saying that. Yeah. Yeah, good. Anything else? Yeah.
May I missed it, did you, or can you clarify the reasons for why you for a covenant with Adam?
Yeah, you know, I've written a little book called Covenant, where I defend that view. It's a very small little book. It's only like 33,000 words that I just did for Crossway, came out recently. Of course, there's debate on whether there's a covenant with Adam, but one of the arguments I would use is those parallels with the covenant with Noah, which I did go over. Though I think those are significant, and what we have with Noah is a covenant. So I think retrospectively we have a covenant with Adam. I think a covenant is I think he's given a stipulation. I think there are stipulations in covenants and curses and blessings if you keep those stipulations. And so I think that's an indication of a covenant. This verse is very debated, but well, Hebrews, I don't know what I'm thinking in my mind. But they, like Adam, have violated the covenant. Now, some people say that's a place name, right? Because it says, there they have betrayed me. So some people take Adam there to be a place name. But the only reference to Adam, I don't remember the exact reference, but the only reference to Adam as a place name is in Joshua. And where it is a place name, it's a positive thing. There is no canonical example of them betraying the Lord at Adam. So I think this verse, the most natural way of reading this is that you have a reference to Adam violating the covenant in the garden. Another argument I'd use, there is no reference to the word covenant in 2 Samuel 7. The word covenant is not used when a covenant is made with David, but later they use the word covenant to describe it. So you don't have to have the word covenant for there to be a covenant. So those are some of the reasons. Yeah. Not everybody, that's a very contested issue, whether there's a covenant. Oh, another argument I'd use, I think, no, it depends on your view of Romans 5, but I think there's a covenantal relationship in Romans 5:12 through 19 between Adam and Christ. You either belong to Adam or Christ, and I think that's covenantal. I mean, Shedd holds the seminal view. Do you know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about these things? Now, I have great respect for Shedd. Shedd's kind of the person who's argued for this, but I think the seminal view only makes sense if you hold a covenantal view. There's no meaningful sense in which we sinned in Adam in which we're conscious. So I feel like the seminal view produces nothing of any help. The only way I think really to explain the relationship between Adam and Christ is covenantal, I'd argue. So feel free to, you can disagree with me on that, that's fine.
Earlier you mentioned the Genesis 6 with the corruption of the daughters of God.
Yeah.
And you just mentioned Shechem, as the Shechemites and the intermarriage. A.W. Pink in Gleanings in Genesis kind of detailed a little bit of what he thought was Satan's efforts to thwart the revealed will of God, going back to Genesis 3:15. Has that influenced your
I don't know Pink. I've never read that book. I've read very little of Pink.
He he mentions that, when it was revealed that it would be through Abraham. Of course, we have, they go down into Egypt, and the males are being thrown into the river by Pharaoh. He's going to come through the tribe of Judah, divided kingdom. Judah's, in the minority. You get 10 tribes against 2. It's going to come through Bethlehem. Of course, you got the death of the children 2 years old and younger. And it just seems that A.W. Pink thought that, as God was revealing more and more through Scripture about the line of Christ, that there was a very demonic, evil influence to try to either corrupt the line or to destroy the line. Through David, Saul's trying to basically kill his own son-in-law. And then right up until Christ is revealed, there's the temptation of Christ, and then of course even the Pharisees seeking to kill Christ. Just seems like every step of the road, Satan is trying to destroy.
I think that's, I mean, of course, I haven't read that and all the particulars, but that sounds right to me. I'm arguing along the same lines. Yeah, that's good. Okay, well, I got to go a little faster, right? But we're going to do that. So let's talk about Exodus a little bit. We'll take a break maybe in 15 minutes or so. When you open the book of Exodus, what's happening? Babies. Lots of babies. What's that? Promises being fulfilled. And really, just as this brother just said, Pharaoh is the offspring of the serpent. What does he want to do? He wants to kill the babies, right? Pharaoh in Ezekiel is called a dragon or Rahab. But, the monsters, they're demonic. The dragon is a demonic dragon, Revelation 12. So Pharaoh's the offspring of the serpent, isn't he? Israel's God's son. Israel's God's firstborn. And the Lord will kill the firstborn of Egypt. So you see the battle of the seeds, right? Who's the Lord going to kill? The offspring of the serpent, and Israel is the son of God. The Lord liberates Israel at the Exodus and the plagues, so that the Exodus is redemption, isn't it? The Exodus is the language of redemption in the New Testament is picked up from the Exodus, and we have an example there of typology, don't we? We have typology with the redemption from Exodus becoming a pattern, correspondence to what God now does in Jesus Christ. Hopefully we'll return to that again. So what a fascinating story. We could look at some of the details, but just to be reminded of Moses as the deliverer of God's people is weak. And that's a very encouraging story just for all of us to think about in ministry. Honestly, if you think of yourself, I don't know any of you, but if you think of yourself, honestly, look at yourself before God and you think, you know what, I can do this. I'm gifted. I'm worried about you. I'm worried about you. I'm very worried about you. Because God uses the weak. God uses the humble. It's a very dangerous thing to study, isn't it? There's a great thing called intellectual arrogance. Think, I'm very gifted, I'm smart, I know theology. Those are all good things, aren't they? They're wonderful things to know the truth. But we're weak. We are weak. We're children. Moses was great at the end of the day because Moses was humble. And there's lots of people who are smart out there, but it's dangerous if you think I'm adequate. I've got what it takes. I'm bright. I'm brilliant. Honestly, I've met some seminary students like that, and usually it doesn't end well. So, but if you feel inadequate, hey, that's how Moses felt. Was there sin in Moses' inadequacy? Is there pride in it? Yeah, there's sin in it. But it was a good place to be. It was a good place to be. So let's remind ourselves of that we need We need to remind ourselves that we're weak and God is great. God reveals himself here as the covenant-keeping God I am. We could talk a lot about that, but I think that's a covenant formula. Promises to free his people from Egypt. A very interesting story along the way, very puzzling story in some ways, where Yahweh threatens to kill Moses on the way, but it's because Moses is going to be the deliverer of the people, and he hasn't kept the covenant sign with his own family. He hasn't circumcised his own children, right? Probably because of Zipporah. It was probably a cultural thing, as much as we can tell. Why does she do it and throw the foreskin at his feet? Probably she's been resisting. And Moses said we need to circumcise, and she's like, we're not going to do that. But the covenant mediator can't be a covenant transgressor, right? So we see the plagues, the Lord delivers his people. Pharaoh starts by asking, right, this is great, who is the Lord? By the end of the story, he knows. Who's the Lord? There's lots of gods out there. But we see hints in the narrative, right? He'll know that there's no one like the Lord our God. Pharaoh's called upon to fear the Lord, isn't he? Paul picks up, what an important text. Paul picks up Exodus 9. Moses says to Pharaoh, now I could have stretched out my hand and struck you and your people with a plague, and you would have been obliterated from the earth. However, I've let you live for this purpose, to show you my power and to make my name known on the whole earth. So, Pharaoh's the most powerful person in the world, but God says, you're a little fly to me. I could have flicked you right off, but I'll tell you why I let you live. So, because I'm proclaiming my name through you, through the plagues, right? The great judgment, through the great deliverance from Egypt that Israel is experiencing, it magnifies God's name. So, that's really encouraging to us, isn't it, to think that way. We think of, you look at the Middle East, where there's very few Christians, and in other places, and think, is God in control? God's working his purposes out. God's working his purposes out in Iran right now, isn't he? Some amazing way. A lot of people are becoming Christians, as you probably know, in Iran. God's working. And sometimes that means allowing evil leaders to continue in their power for some time. So, just an encouraging word on God's sovereignty. God is king. Pharaoh hardened his own heart, and the Lord hardened his heart. That's a huge issue. I would argue, fundamentally, God hardened his heart. I agree with Greg Beale's interpretation of this passage. I don't know if you've seen his article years ago in Trinity Journal. Fundamentally, God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And it's also true that Pharaoh hardened his own heart. But God was sovereign over Pharaoh's heart. He hardened his heart. Pharaoh is not exempt from guilt, even though God hardened his heart. The biblical narrative holds these things together, doesn't it? God is sovereign, and yet the evil that Pharaoh does, he's accountable for that evil. Now, we're not attempting to give in this class. Now, which psalm is it in? I may not be able to find this right off. We're not attempting to give in this class a philosophical resolution to the problem of evil. But the Lord made his people very fruitful. He made them more numerous than their foes. This is talking about in Egypt. And the hearts of the Egyptians, he turned to hate his people. God did that. God did that. But their hatred of his people was sin. At the same time, I have a lot of friends who read that text who are Arminian and say, well, if that's true, if God turned their hearts to hate him, then they can't be accountable. then they're puppets. But of course, that's not what the text is saying. That's what the psalmist is saying. God was sovereign over what was happening in the decisions they made. He even turned their hearts to hate them, and yet God is not the author of their evil in a particular sense, is he? Finally. So that's a fascinating theme to see as we think about biblical theology. Okay. We see the Passover theme, which anticipates Christ's death. 1 Corinthians 5. Christ, our Passover, was sacrificed. Removed the leaven for Paul is evil, isn't it? It points to removing evil from your life. There's a great deliverance. Remove evil from your life. The Last Supper is a Passover meal. So the Passover sacrifice is fulfilled in the cross of Jesus Christ. Some of this stuff I'm going to skip. You're reading my book as well. Exodus 19 through 24, the Mosaic covenant, similar to the suzerain vassal treaties in some ways of that day. You see God as a covenant Lord. I just want to say a couple things about this covenant that I want to hit on, that I talk about in the book as well. But one of the things I want to say is it's wrong to say that's a legalistic covenant. Some people say, well, that was a legalistic covenant. The earliest dispensationalists, no dispensationalist says this today, but in the Scofield, the original Scofield Bible says that when God gives the stipulations of the covenant, that Israel should have said no. When instead of saying all the words of this law we will do, that the Israelites should have said, no, we can't do the law, and we're not agreeing. Well, I'll tell you one thing, that is like a terrible, horrible misreading of the text, because the Lord would have been very angry if they said no. Here's my covenant. No, thank you. We don't want to do that. No, it's not a legalistic covenant because God elected them to be his people, right? Deuteronomy 7. He loved them. That's a great passage. He loved them because he loved them. Why does the Lord love them? He loved them because he loved them. Do you know the little jingle? How odd of God to choose the Jews. You heard that rhyme? Indeed. How odd of God to choose the Jews. How odd of God to choose anybody. If he chose the people, why did he choose the Jews? Well, why did he choose you? Why does he choose anyone? I mean, why does he love them? He loves them because he loves them. So God gave them the law after he delivered them from Egypt, didn't he? So he saved them and delivered them. So it's not a legalistic covenant. Israel's to be a kingdom of priests. They're to be a blessing to the world. They're to be a new Adam in the Garden of Canaan, right? As priest kings. Well, we see the Mosaic covenant as complex because you also see the thunder and lightning in Exodus 19. What do you think of when you see Exodus 19? What do you think of in the New Testament, the thunder and lightning? Somebody tell me. What passage? What passage do you think of in the New Testament? Hebrews 12, absolutely. Hebrews 12. In Hebrews 12, he contrasts that with the New Covenant, doesn't he? So the covenant is gracious, but it's also conditional. Israel must keep the covenant stipulations. They must do what God has commanded to enjoy fellowship with him. The Sabbath is the covenant sign. It's the heart of the covenant, symbolizing Israel's rest and enjoyment. And then the Ten Commandments. I just want to say a word about the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments are about God being supreme in our lives, right? No other gods. God's first. God's first in our life above all else, above anything else. Gerhard von Rad, I love this quote, the intolerant claim for exclusive worship is something unique in the history of religion. Isn't that great? Still bothers people today, doesn't it? we believe in that exclusivity. The first commandment and the 10th commandment, they're the same commandment, right? You shall have no other gods before me. What you covet is your God. Paul tells us that, doesn't he? What you desire, if you desire someone else's wife, someone else's reputation, someone else's house, that's your God, finally. That's what you're worshiping. And that flows into all the commandments. So if you're stealing, you're worshiping what? Security, material prosperity. You're desiring something more than God. If you're committing sexual sin, committing adultery, you're worshiping what? Physical pleasure, whatever it is. Every one of the commandments is informed by the first and the 10th commandment, every time. So the commandments have a depth to them, don't they? They're not just mere external rules. They reveal whether God is Lord in one's heart. Okay, well, we're going to do more on this, but we need to take a 10-minute break again. I need to run to the restroom. You probably need to take a break, so let's take another 10-minute break.